Or you should just think about it. How are we gonna, is somebody gonna give us like a time frame? I mean, I'm not planning on talking for more than like 2 minutes over each thing, and then I want to ask a question. But is there?
There he is.
Thank you, everybody.
Yours looks
we're ready to
good.
get started.
Yours looks good.
First, I want to welcome you to our presentation, Law and Disorder, Criminal Justice on TV and in Real Life. We're doing this presentation and this webcast to commemorate Constitution Day, which actually fell yesterday, September 17th. Constitution Day is a federal holiday that recognizes and honors the day that the United States Constitutional Convention signed the Constitution in 1787. Our program today is going to be taking a look at the realities of our criminal justice system and the ways in which our popular understanding of it is shaped by television, the shows that are ubiquitous, that appear almost every night in prime time, that show us how the police operate, how the criminal justice system in general operates. I want to start off by thanking the ACLU for hosting us very generously. I also want to thank Brave New Films for preparing the short film that we're going to see in a few moments. I want to thank Cesar Chavez Public Charter School for Public Policy for joining us here live as our live audience. I also want to thank everyone who's watching on our webcast. Just a few administrative things. I'm going to give a brief introduction, then we're going to watch the film, and then we're going to hear from our panelists. And I really want to encourage both the students here and the students and other people who are watching online to join in the discussion, to ask questions. So our panelists are going to give brief sort of comments on the 5 myths that we're going to see in the film, but we'd really encourage you. I think this is going to be a lot more interesting if you were engaged. So for people in our audience, raise your hand if you have a question. For those who are watching online, we'd like you to tweet your questions to hashtag law disorder. So if you just tweet your questions, I'll be monitoring that hashtag so that I can ask our panelists to weigh in on the questions that we receive online. Our panelists today, directly to my left, we have Norm Reamer. He's the Executive Director of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, or NACDL. NACDL comprises the criminal defense attorneys who are on the front lines of representing defendants and working to ensure that the criminally accused get a chance at the fair trial they are constitutionally entitled to. Here in D.C. and at the state and local level, NACDL encourages a rational, humane criminal justice policy for America, one that promotes fairness for all, due process for even the least among us who may be accused of wrongdoing, compassion for witnesses and victims of crime, and just punishment for the guilty. Next to Norman is Vanita Gupta, who is the Deputy Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU. Vanita is the ACLU is our nation's guardian of liberty, working daily in courts, legislatures, and communities to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties that the Constitution and laws of the United States guarantee everyone in this country. Vanita is also director of the ACLU's Center for Justice, which uses litigation, legislative advocacy, and public education to address systemic problems in the U.S. criminal justice system, including police abuse of power, the treatment of prisoners, and the death penalty. Vanita oversees the ACLU's national campaign to end overcriminalization, working with ACLU affiliates all over the country to advance a more rational, effective, and fair criminal justice system. And next to Vanita, is Virginia Sloan, president of the Constitution Project. Created out of the belief that we must cast aside the labels that divide us in order to keep our democracy strong, the Constitution Project brings together policy experts and legal practitioners from across the political spectrum to find agreement on solutions to the most difficult constitutional challenges of our time. TCP seeks to reform the nation's broken criminal justice system through scholarship, advocacy, policy reform, and public education initiatives. My name is Christopher DeRocher. I'm the Government Affairs Counsel at the Constitution Project. So today we're looking at how the myths perpetrated by popular television result in misconceptions about our criminal justice system, and how that contributes to the constitutional infirmities that actually exist in our system. Just to give you an idea, in the 2011-2012 television season, 9 out of the top 50 rated shows had something to do with the criminal justice system. Shows like CSI, Law and Order, Hawaii Five-0, NCIS. That's nearly 20% of all of the most popular shows. Another 7 helped round out the top 100. And that's not counting the scores of shows on basic cable and premium cable that purport to deal with the way that our criminal justice system works. In a recent media survey, it was concluded that 7 characters in primetime shows are murdered each night. If you look at the television population, that's 2% of the television population each night being murdered. Does this reflect what our society is? Does this reflect what happens in real life? If you get your information from television, which I think a lot of us do, unless you've been unfortunate enough to have to deal with the criminal justice system yourself, or you work in the criminal justice system, television is where you get your idea of how our police and court systems work. And so it stands to reason that you would think that this might be how it really is. Up to 50% of all crimes depicted on TV are homicides, even though homicides account for a much lower percentage. of crimes. Another thing is you look at the victims and perpetrators of crimes on these popular television shows. By and large, very often, white women are the victims of crimes on television shows, even though they are the least likely demographic to be victims of homicide. In fact, from 1980 to 2008, black people were 6 times more likely to be the victims of homicide, and men were 3 times more likely. Also on TV, a murder is perpetrated, investigated, solved. The accused is tried and convicted, all within what seems like a matter of days or weeks. But the reality is justice is not that swift. A recent study in New York City revealed that the average wait for a murder or attempted murder trial is more than 2 years. About a third of the people who are facing these charges are out on bail, which means that a large majority of defendants sit in jail for 2 years waiting to be tried. And not all of those people end up being convicted, which means there are people who are not guilty of these crimes who sit in jail for up to 2 years. One of the other things that you see in television is the use of DNA evidence, but DNA evidence is used in maybe 5 to 10% of cases. You see the plucky forensics investigator who finds that little piece of DNA that conclusively leads to the identity of the perpetrator and a swift conviction. But in fact, eyewitness testimony, which its reliability has been questioned, is far more likely to be the centerpiece of any criminal prosecution. A couple of other things that we may want to consider is how are defense attorneys portrayed in these shows. Oftentimes they're either portrayed as bad guys who are looking to trick the system into getting someone who's guilty off scot-free, or they're portrayed as incompetent young public defenders who are completely incapable of being able to advocate and represent their attorneys. So today we'd like to think about how those types of representations really affect what we expect out of our criminal justice system. And when we expect these things out of our criminal justice system, are we holding it accountable for what it's supposed to be and what it's doing wrong? So with that, I'd like to show you the film, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists.
In the United States of America, there are 2 criminal justice systems, one that exists on television and the other that prosecutes and incarcerates real people.
If you look at the TV shows, some of the cop shows are very good and they're very compelling drama, but they're basically about murder, rape, and robbery. Now, murder, rape, and robbery are not the most common crime.
We're here on a murder investigation.
You're under arrest for the murder of Jody Watson.
You're under arrest for sexual assault.
You're under arrest for murder.
Well, based on the entry wound, they were both murdered, but here's where it gets fun.
Fact is that violent crime is actually the smallest percentage of all crime.
Most offenders are arrested for property crimes and for drug and drug-related offenses.
And I think the average person watching television would tend to conclude that violent crime is becoming more and more of a problem. And I think the consequence of that is that many states, although they're fairly bankrupt, are spending a lot more on prisons in order to be safe against violent crime.
Mr. Gruber, I have bent over backward to give your client second, third, and fourth chances.
Our sentencing system is very much skewed because of mandatory minimums. Mandatory minimums means that you're taking the discretion away from the judge.
There have been times in which I've known of judges, federal, state, are literally in tears because they know that this sentence is inappropriate. And so they would apologize to people, but as they're sending them to prison for 10 years, they know full well it really shouldn't even be a prison sentence, or maybe 1 or 2 years. But they have to follow the law.
Murder 2, 15 to life.
To a term of 15 years.
25 years to life.
People don't understand that the length of our sentences is just tremendously disproportionate. The average sentence that Americans receive on being convicted for a crime is twice as long as people in England, 3 times as long as people in Canada, 4 times as long as the Dutch, and 5 to 10 times as long as the French.
This can end very well for you.
What are you doing, detective? What are you doing talking to my client without me present? You sneaky Pete.
Detective?
Interview's over.
I have no problem answering questions.
Don't say another word.
The idea that most people have rich and famous attorneys with unlimited funds and unlimited resources, again, is very far from the truth.
So the system is hugely balanced in favor of people with money.
Most folks who are charged with criminal offenses don't have those types of resources, and oftentimes if they are represented by court-appointed counsel, counsel doesn't have those types of resources available to them.
Yeah, there's no question but that the public defense bar throughout the country is underfunded.
So the ability to devote the time and the resources that are needed, especially in the field of indigent defense, is very difficult.
It is a form of injustice.
You reached a verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Kenneth Jackson, guilty as charged.
We find the defendant guilty. Not guilty.
Guilty.
Not guilty.
What's good TV? Good TV is seeing a trial. Probably about 5% or less of cases actually go to trial.
Prosecutors in this country have a tremendous amount of leverage over defendants.
Many defendants are told that if they choose to not accept a plea bargain, they'll face additional charges or more serious charges.
Neither the defense bar nor the prosecutor advises the defendant about the potential consequences.
The felony conviction that restricts your ability to seek meaningful employment. You might lose your right to vote.
You have to show the public you go after the rich.
Your client killed in cold blood. I don't care if he's homeless or owns Grand Central Station.
I want to believe in justice.
Reality is that justice is not blind. Black people are far more likely, 10 times as likely to be arrested, more likely to be prosecuted, more likely to be convicted, and more likely to be sentenced than white people.
I began to see who we were targeting, who we were going after. I would notice that most of the time was always appeared to be urban areas.
Use of drugs cuts across all ethnic and economic lines, but the people that get sent to prison for them are grossly disproportionately lower income people and people of color.
If we was locking up everybody, white and black, for the same thing, they would have said, let's stop this craziness, because you're not putting my son in jail.
The injustice is to society at large.
That's the true tragedy of it.
All right, well, now that we've taken a look at 5 of what I think are many of the misconceptions of how our criminal justice system operates, I want to turn to our panelists. And first I'd like to turn to Norm to sort of lead our discussion on the misperception that the justice system largely focuses on violent crime.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and thank you all for joining us today, both here in the room and those of you who are watching on the internet. Any day that starts with people showing an interest in the criminal justice system, as far as I'm concerned, is a really good day. I also want to thank Vanita and Ginny for inviting me to join them on this panel. Before I turn to this first myth, which is that most crimes in this country are violent, I just want to get a sense of how many of you have thought of a career in the criminal justice system? Either side. I don't care if it's law enforcement, defense, any part of the system. Well, that's good. That's about 8, 9 hands, and I hope by the end of our discussion maybe there'll be some additional hands going up, because we're here to talk about the criminal justice system, to try to talk to you about myth versus reality, but underneath it all, as Chris said, we're here to celebrate the Constitution. And the criminal justice system and the Constitution are really your criminal justice system and your Constitution. And you're going to decide what it means for the next generation and the generation after that. And I'm sure that most of us who are here today realize that the Constitution as we understand it in 2012 doesn't mean the same thing as the Constitution when it was written in 1789. And that evolution is a result of what each generation of Americans do to bring it to the next level. So that's the context in which we want to have this discussion. So when we talk about most crimes being violent, as the film showed and as Chris said, only a tiny percentage of the real crime in this country is violent crime, is homicide. And what we really want to get at is the truth about how much crime in this country is man-made crime. And what do I mean by that? Violent crime and fundamental crimes like stealing and attacking people, those crimes have their origins in some moral code. Whatever your religion happens to be, or even if you have no religion that you practice, there are certain fundamental moral concepts that give rise to those crimes. But that's not what most crime in this country is. So let me just ask you this question, and I really want to get you guys involved. What do you think the most common crime in the United States of America is? Robbery? No. Next.
Drug offenses.
Drug offenses? No, but you're getting closer. How about over here?
Drug trafficking.
Similar, close, but not there.
Taxes.
Okay. My panelists will no, it's not taxes. My co-panelists will jump in. But the last time I did any checking on this or read any reports, the single most common crime in the United States is driving without a license. And very close to that is smoking marijuana. The fact of the matter is that we as a society have decided to make certain things crimes. So now let me ask you this. Who decides what a crime is? Right here in the front row.
The society itself.
That's right, the society. And who is it that actually makes that decision in society? The people. And who are the people's representatives? They're politicians. Their legislatures and their governors and their mayors and their city councils, city councilmen and their president. And how do we make those decisions? Okay, we've decided that it's a crime to smoke marijuana in most places. That's somewhat changing now. We've decided that. But why haven't we decided that it's a crime to drink alcohol?
It's an economic boom.
It's an economic boom. Well, maybe it'll be an economic boom if we legalize and regulate marijuana. And let's not forget, right? You guys probably know that there was a time in this country when it was illegal to use, possess, manufacture alcohol. So let me ask you this next question to put again this myth in context. How much crime do we actually have? What would you say? I want to see people taking a guess. How many people do you think get arrested in the United States every year? 50,000 a year? Yeah, okay.
Probably 150 to 200,000 people.
Okay.
1 million.
1 million. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Getting warmer.
What if I were to say to you, and again, I'll ask my panelists if I've got this number wrong, somewhere between 50 and 65,000, 50 and 65 million arrests take place every year. Does that sound right? Arrests.
That sounds right.
Yeah. How many people do we have in prison in the United States?
2% of the population.
Huh?
2 billion.
How many?
What? A billion.
No, not a billion. No, our population is about 300 million.
150 million.
No, not 100. We're 300 million people in this country, so.
Like 4% of the
You said it.
Right, yeah, he said it right here. 2.3 million people. Now, okay, one more. Where does the United States rank in terms of our prison population in the world?
Number one.
Number one, USA, number one. Okay, so I'm gonna before I turn it over to my fellow panelists on this topic, I'm gonna ask you if you are aware that some of these things are actually crimes. Do you know that in New York City it is a crime to take up 2 seats on a subway?
Yes.
You know that, okay. Do you know that in some communities in this country, I know of some particularly in Florida, where it is a crime to feed the homeless?
What?
That's correct. This is how people, so what's going on here? What's going on here is we've made a decision as a society that we're going to use the criminal law to control social behavior. And this is what people don't really understand. Our system, and many of the other myths are a reflection of this, is a result of the fact that our system is clogged with this. Some I'm from New York, so I have a lot of New York stories, okay? My mayor right now has decided that they're no longer going to be able to sell big bottles of soda. Now, I don't fault him. I know what he's trying to get at. There are a lot of people that are overweight. It's a health problem. But if you look at what kills people, maybe instead of looking at marijuana, we have to look at sugar. Maybe we have to make it a crime to sell sugar. This could happen. Wow. This is the problem with allowing the criminal law to get away from the sort of moral basis of banning things which are inherently wrong and using it as a means of control. Vanita, what do you think? What can we do to solve this?
Well, and I think sometimes the frame that we use in our criminal justice system is wrong. Instead of asking, so who was harmed, right? Because when you're talking about drug crimes, drug possession, people often think that there's always kind of a bloody victim involved in a crime. But if you change the kinds of questions, or if lawmakers change the questions that they were asking before enacting a whole host of criminal laws, and we're instead asking, so who was harmed? What was the harm? And how do we best address the harm to prevent that harm from happening in the future? That's a very different set of questions than lawmakers are asking themselves, or have been for the last 40 years, about, who are we mad at and how long can we put that person in prison and never let that person see the day of light. And I think that is been part of the problem that's resulted in our system of mass incarceration today. That's why we are number one in the world with incarceration, and that is not something that we should be proud of. That is not something that the Constitution, that we should be imbuing the Constitution with, to the extent that we believe that the Constitution is a document that should be whose interpretation should be evolving into a progressive line and making us all better as a society. Our system of mass incarceration has really caused us to put some of that into question, to question what are the values of the Constitution and how have they been hurt through our system of mass incarceration over the last 40 years. Some of you probably see this even in school as playing itself out, where 20 years ago a disruption in school that may have resulted in a trip to the principal's office now actually results in kids as young as 6 years old in Florida and other parts of the country getting arrested for talking out in school or having a behavioral problem, and that is kind of part of what Norman has been talking about. Norman's been talking about kind of the misimpression of people really thinking that our country must be just so incredibly violent. I mean, given that we stand out in the world, our country with those kinds of statistics, we would think it must be just so much more violent. There must be something inherently violent about Americans, but we know that isn't true. What we have chosen to do is criminalize a whole bunch of things that really, frankly, could be better addressed through public health issues. When someone's got an addiction to drugs, there are better ways to intervene in that person's life to turn it around than to lock someone up for an enormously long amount of time, which is what we are doing here. And that leads me to the second myth, which is on severe sentencing in this country, that the punishment should fit the crime. There are two factors that cause people to that have fueled our system of mass incarceration in this country. One is the number of people coming into the system. And when Norman's telling you about that incredibly high number that should shock us all around the number of people getting arrested every year in this country, that is one of the key factors of why our system has ballooned so exponentially in the last 40 years. But another factor of why our system is so large is the amount of time that people stay behind bars in this country. The amount of time the sentencing schemes in this country are so disproportionate to any sentencing schemes around the world. And it's until, you heard Susan Herman in the film talk about and compare our sentencing schemes to those in other parts of the world. But there are stories that are very real that come to our attention all the time at the ACLU. Willie Sauls in Texas got 45 years for purse snatching because he was subject to a habitual offender law. Another person in Texas, Larry Dairies, got 70 years for stealing a tuna sandwich. Anthony Crutcher got 60 years for selling $40 of cocaine. Jason Hernandez got a life without parole. Life without parole, will never see the day of light for selling drugs, a nonviolent offense. Cornell Hood got life without parole for marijuana possession in Louisiana. And these are, granted, may seem incredibly extreme, but because of habitual offender laws that basically stack sentences, you can see in this country sentences like this come to life. These are real people serving real time in prison. And until there's a sense of, in broader American society, of what it really means to spend a day, a month, a year in prison, the way that we meet these sentences out without asking, well, is this sentence really going to help us reduce recidivism? Is this going to help this person come out into society and allow them to become a productive member? Those aren't necessarily the questions that we've been asking. And our sentencing schemes are so incredibly out of whack to the rest of the world that I think for nonviolent and violent offenses, we are a country that has retained the death penalty, unlike most other countries in the world. And we have to remember that by setting the bar that kind of high and frankly in violation of so many human rights standards, that has already started, it's kind of created a different baseline for this country around sentencing. And so I'm curious about how many of you in this country think that that we are meting out those kinds of lengthy sentences for nonviolent offenses. How many of you have heard of people serving more than 10 years for a drug offense? That's a significant, so that's about half of the students in this room know of people serving more than 10 years for drug offenses. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so what would you say to the people who feel like me, who feel like if you know having marijuana or selling cocaine is illegal, if you're doing it, you should go to jail and pay the time because you know it's illegal, you shouldn't be doing it, therefore you should pay the time. What would you say to people who think that way?
Sure. So I will. Well, did one of the students want to respond? Did you want to respond, or did you have another question?
No, I just wanted to respond.
Sure, you can respond, and then I will. And one of us can respond.
I mean, as a society, we make it our priority to have social norms, to have the idea of like what is wrong and what is right, and so it was like. For decades, we sell tobacco. For decades, we sell alcohol, knowing that it affects our bodies as much as it does for marijuana and cocaine. We as a society know that cocaine comes from a plant. The idea of what a plant became and what it evolved was terrible, and how we deal with it is terrible. We lock up individuals for selling minuscule amount of items because of social issues, meaning like poverty. Individuals mostly in poverty have that idea of like, this is my way out, this is how I'm going to get my economic benefits, instead of having a real job or something like that. That's how they grew up. Like marijuana, the idea is like, we victimize, we say that it's a violation of our social beliefs when we see that, they're statistically speaking that things can work, things are capable of implementing things in the system like legalizing marijuana but reforming it to the point where like we could use it as an economic benefit instead of like a social issue.
So you're relating it to the fact that for a lot of these crimes there's kind of an economic cause, or poverty may be the cause. And I will take another, and I think that that's one response, and it may not be satisfying to you. Another one is that to the extent that society has decided to ban drugs, and you have a percentage of the population that is addicted to drugs, or maybe in possession of drugs because of an addiction. The question to me is, how does incarceration help with that addiction without any kind of access to services in prison, without any, oftentimes actually drugs may be available in prison because of contraband, that we are doing a bad job of actually addressing the root causes and conditions that people may be in that have caused them to have this addiction. We just have used incarceration as the answer to everything, to every social problem. If you've got a kid who's got a behavioral problem, well, use the criminal justice system. If you have a perceived immigration problem, well, throw them into a detention center. If you have somebody who's got a drug addiction problem, who's probably going to cycle in and out of prison unless they have their addiction treated, well, we're just going to use the criminal justice system. And it's proven to be quite ineffective. I mean, the war on drugs was declared by President Nixon about 40 years ago. We spent over $70 billion on it, and yet there has not really been a dent made into kind of the supply and demand for drugs. And I think that's the question, is that society can make a judgment as to behavior that it deems that it wants to deem criminal, but how effective is our system at actually addressing what has caused people to have addiction problems? This is one example, and I don't know if others want to address it.
Yeah, I'd like to say something. I had the opportunity to work for many years for the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee, and one of my responsibilities was the issue of crime. And so I was right there in the middle of the sausage being made. Often legislation is referred to as a sausage making process, and nobody wants to see it. Well, I will tell you that the way legislation is often made is for legislators to try to out-tough each other. I'm tougher on crime than you are, and they think that will appeal to their constituents. So, for example, I'll give you 2 examples. You may or may not remember Len Bias, who was a great basketball player who OD'd on cocaine. And immediately Congress said, well, we got to do something about this cocaine problem, and they enacted a whole bunch of new drug laws to deal with the quote-unquote Len Bias problem, despite the fact that the states already had laws. So we now had duplicate federal and state laws, and we had because they wanted to seem tough, they created long sentences to go with what may be victimless crimes or fairly minor crimes, but for political reasons they created these long long sentences. There was another example, there were a spate of carjackings. And again, it's a state crime, but the federal legislators wanted to show that they were tough on crime, and so they created a federal crime of carjacking. And again, even if no one was hurt, there were long sentences that were created. And a third example is much more recent, and that is the disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentences. Years ago, there was a belief that people who used crack as opposed to powder cocaine, crack was much more dangerous than powder, and that it needed to be punished at a much higher level, 100 to 1, as opposed to powder cocaine. And of course, who uses crack cocaine? It's generally people of color. Powder cocaine is more expensive. It's generally used by white people, and so you had this enormous racial disparity. And then and of course Congress was in there acting and creating these crimes, telling the Sentencing Commission what to do, creating mandatory minimum sentences. And it's only recently come out that none of that was true, and that there are the same physical effects of crack versus powder cocaine, and there are these enormous racial disparities. And so people are starting to realize that they needed to change this disparity. Now, it's still not 1 to 1. It's still not the same sentence for powder as opposed to crack, but we're getting there. They've lowered the disparity considerably. But still, that shows you, in addition, that there is a lot of racial misunderstanding, racial discrimination in the legislature and in the criminal justice system in particular. So you really have to look at the fact that these crimes are not they're not really being decided by the policymakers on the merits. They're being decided on the basis of politics, and that's certainly no way to run a criminal justice system.
Well, I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative to ask the audience here and also the audience watching online if they want to weigh in at #LawDisorder to this question. So, we're talking about over-incarceration, throwing people in jail because we disapprove of what they're doing. Do you guys have any ideas about other ways that we as a society could show disapproval for certain behavior without just throwing people in jail? Yeah.
Kevin Jameson. I believe that a way to change is that instead of prisons making it so based off third grade testing scores, that you should stop implementing that just to show that kids do and make them have a future, let them know that they mean something than a prison cell waiting for them if they fail school. And that's so far what I think that we for the justice system to make small slight changes and it can impact society greatly.
So really getting the education system involved to prevent people from ever ending up engaged sort of with the criminal justice system. Yeah.
Victor, I guess we can also start up better rehabilitation centers, because most juveniles nowadays, they're put in adult prison and they're not the same age, they don't have the same mindset, and they're treated worse. So I guess implementing safer rehabilitation centers will actually stop the issue of drugs, or help them.
So both comments so far talk about redirecting resources from prisons into other approaches, be it education or rehabilitation.
The gentleman in the back.
He stole my
answer. No, he stole your answer. All right.
I like to add on to what Victor said. My name is Kimari, and along with people who get sent to prison for using crack cocaine or whatever type of drugs that are illegal, instead of deeming them bad people, saying this is bad, you should go to jail, they should tell them how it affects their body. Even though some people know they get addicted to a drug so much that it becomes like it's a habit. So I think they should let them know how it affects their body and what other type of alternatives they can I guess use to, get off of crack cocaine, like Victor said, better rehabilitation services and stuff, instead of just throwing them in jail.
First, I think the social norms need to change. Oh, I'm Jamaica. And I think the social norms need to change, because that's how our justice system runs, basically, right? If the society disapproves of something, then there's a change, there's a law enacted that, that we, counterparts that how the society believes. So I think, along with Victor and Kevin said, it obviously includes education, but it's more of just like us need to like stop and reflect and reevaluate, what's normal, what's the social norms basically, and how we react to that. And I think that's what needs to change.
So maybe taking a look at what behavior privately we find acceptable versus sort of what we claim we find unacceptable publicly, and trying to make those sort of reflect each other more closely than they do right now.
Let me, just before we turn the issue over, how many of you know what part of the Constitution allows for a challenge to a sentence that may seem so disproportionate or so kind of so long compared to what the crime is? What can people do? How do lawyers address that? Do you know what part of the Constitution allows for a challenge? Is there a part of the Constitution?
I don't think so. Is there? Aren't those called appeals?
So, well, there are appeals, but the part of the Constitution that advocates rely on to challenge a perceived excessive sentence is the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Go ahead.
My name is Counsel. That is in the Constitution, but it doesn't. It's not actually defined, so you can't really say that there's no person can be held to no or cruel or unusual punishment if it's not defined in the Constitution. So it's like, it's really hypocrite in itself, because it says this, but we see kids or adults get 20 years, 50 years, all years in prison, but it's hypocrite.
That gets really into the question of how dynamic the Constitution is, and why I always talk about the fact that each generation gets the right to shape what the Constitution means. The amendment that Vanita talked about says there shall be no cruel and unusual punishment. But what does that mean? And there are some judges that say, well, it means that if it wasn't acceptable at the time the Constitution was written, then that's cruel and unusual. Others have now said, well, it actually has to be defined by how society's thinking has changed. And this is, I'm so glad that Vanita brought this up, because this is one area where something new is happening for the first time in maybe 30 years. Because you're absolutely right. The court has very much stayed away from ever saying that a sentence of imprisonment is cruel and unusual, no matter how long. We know you can't draw and quarter people. We know we can't, at least we thought until 9/11, we couldn't under any circumstances torture people. And we still don't use that as part of our criminal justice system. But the length of a sentence, well, it's just within the last few years that first the Supreme Court said that you can't have the death penalty for somebody who was a juvenile. when they committed the crime. And now the Supreme Court has said you can't have life without parole, without the possibility of parole. So maybe there'll come a day where the Supreme Court will say, you know what? You can't give out these sentences that Vanita described. You can't send somebody to prison for 50 years for selling, a few joints because they had a couple of crimes before in their past. So there's hope that it can evolve.
I want to say that a lot of this depends on, frankly, who's sitting on the Supreme Court. There is a real division between whether the court should find anything to be cruel and unusual, and other justices who say, let's really look at the facts, like the juvenile life without possibility of parole case, where the people who decided, who are on the side of evaluating the facts to decide if something is cruel and unusual, prevailed. So it's very important who is on our courts who make these decisions.
But I think it's equally important to also look at our lawmakers, because I think increasingly lawyers who have been traditionally always trying to give meaning to the Eighth Amendment in courts, it's become very difficult to say that a sentence actually violates the Eighth Amendment, as you correctly pointed out. And so there's been a lot more work being done now in state legislatures with federal Congress to convince lawmakers that our sentencing schemes have just gone so out of whack, or that there are just too many crimes on the books that really don't protect our public safety or are not necessary to. So there's a lot of work that people are doing to actually in some ways give meaning to the Eighth Amendment through other ways, by passing more reasoned and rational laws. And that's one way to actually change societal norms, is actually to work with lawmakers rather than just always relying on courts and having often the door slammed in your face for that. So there are different ways that people can actually make a difference to give meaning to the Constitution, even if they never want to become lawyers.
Take one more question, then we need to move on to the next topic.
Okay, I have a question. Okay, so I'm kind of on a project on the Eighth Amendment. Well, it has to deal with the Eighth Amendment, but I wanted to ask, in the Fifth Amendment, it says a person can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process, and of course, like due process going through the court system and that whole process. So, do you think that kind of is a reason why the death penalty is justified, because you have been through the whole criminal process, you've been tried, or whatever the situation may be, and I guess a person may have been found guilty, so their life, I guess, is being taken away. Do you think the Fifth Amendment kind of like justifies that?
Can I first say, I think it's fabulous that you're sitting there holding a copy of the Constitution and you're actually reading it, and I hope you all will do that. And that's a really good question. It's one that a lot of scholars have debated, a lot of judges have debated, and the question of whether we should have a death penalty has changed over the years, and the court at one time decided that it was arbitrary and capricious. It was, there was no real system for deciding who got the death penalty and why, and so they stopped it for a while, and then they decided, well, now the states have fixed their statutes and let's put it back in place, and it is still the case that it's arbitrary and capricious, and so when you talk about due process, I mean, the death penalty implicates all sorts of things, like the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. There is the Sixth Amendment, whether you have a good lawyer who's going to really represent you, the due process clause, are you really getting a fair trial? There are all sorts of constitutional provisions that relate to the death penalty, and more people are coming to see not only are there serious constitutional violations that lead to wrongful convictions, wrongful sentences. We know of people who have very likely been innocent, yet they've been executed. But more and more people are also coming to see, and this doesn't relate to the Constitution, but that the death penalty is much, much more expensive to implement than life without parole. and that it is not bringing any different results. It's not doing what people thought it would do. So there is, the opinion in this country is changing about whether the death penalty is worth it on all sorts of fronts.
And I think that actually naturally leads into our next topic, which is that the accused always get a fair and adequate defense. So Norm, I'd like to turn to you.
Well, I appreciate that. And when introducing me and describing an ACDL, the one thing that I would also like to point out is that I was a criminal defense lawyer for almost 30 years. So this is a topic that is very near and dear to me. The myth in the film is that everybody gets a good defense. And the film, of course, suggests that that's probably not true because the system is so overburdened and the lawyers have so much work that they have to handle. They have so many cases to handle. But I'd like to go back to basics with you for a moment and ask you about, since we're talking about celebrating the Constitution, who knows why you have a right to counsel and where that right comes from? Where in the Constitution does that come from?
I just told you.
Which? No, Sixth Amendment, okay? But now let me ask you this question, and this is kind of like a little trick question. Where in the Constitution says everybody has the right to counsel. The Sixth Amendment provides for that, and without getting too technical, the 14th Amendment said that that applies even when it's the states that are prosecuting you, not just the federal government. But where in the Constitution does it say that if you're too poor to afford to hire a lawyer, you have a right to a lawyer?
7.
9.
It doesn't. Where does it come from? Nope. It comes from another. You're onto a case. You're on the right track, okay? 50 years ago, there was a man by the name of Clarence Earl Gideon who was prosecuted for breaking and entering in, I believe it was Florida, and it was a felony. It was a state prosecution, and he couldn't afford a lawyer. And he asked the court to give him one. And the court said, no, we don't do that here in Florida. We don't have to do that. And he ended up, you mentioned appeals, right here, the gentleman in the front row here mentioned appeals. He ended up writing out his own request to the United States Supreme Court. And that led to, he asked the court to review his case and say that he had a right to a lawyer. And next March will be the 50th anniversary of a decision called Gideon v. Wainwright, which held that a person has the right to the appointment of counsel even if they can't afford one. And that is a very, very fundamental right in this country. And by the way, Clarence Gideon, after the case was sent back, had a lawyer. The lawyer did the things that lawyers are supposed to do. He investigated the case, he questioned the witnesses, and guess what? He was found not guilty. So it's really, it's really a fundamental right. And so the question now is, well, why is the system so overburdened? How can we have this right and not have lawyers with the adequate resources and responsible caseloads? So I'd like to ask you a couple of really fundamental questions, okay? First of all, who needs a lawyer? Everybody. Exactly. Why?
Because everybody's
Equal representation. What was the other reason?
I say everybody is equal, so.
Okay. I'm going to put it to you in another way, not just because everybody is equal and everybody should have a fair chance, but let me ask you something. Is there anybody here who has ever done anything wrong? And I'm not asking it that it necessarily be criminal. Is there anyone here who has ever done anything wrong? Raise your hand. Okay. Is there anyone here who has ever been accused of doing something that you didn't do? Okay. Everybody needs a lawyer. Okay? And now my second question, and then I'm going to turn it over, is what is the role of the criminal defense lawyer in our system? What do you think the role is of the criminal defense lawyer?
A shield. A shield.
A shield? Excellent. What else? What else?
Protect individual rights.
Protect individual rights. What else?
Make sure the
defendant has a fair trial.
To make sure that the defendant, the accused person, has a fair trial.
Along with what he said, to represent the defendant and, because the defendant may be innocent. So.
All of these answers are exactly the truth. Everybody has a right to counsel because maybe they did it and they should have a better result than what the prosecution wants. Maybe they didn't do it. A lawyer is the person that stands up for the dignity of every human being. And that is the most fundamental right we have. When the government prosecutes somebody, short of warfare, it is the most awesome use of the power of the government. It's to take away your liberty, in some cases to take away your life, to leave you with disadvantages for the rest of your life. I don't care how minor the charge is, because of all the different consequences. When you have to answer that questionnaire that says you've been convicted of a crime, this is an enormous, enormous power. And the only way to meet that power is with a qualified and zealous defense lawyer. And unfortunately, and this will come back then to all of the other problems we've talked about, we can't have that when the system is so clogged up that the lawyers who are there to represent the poor people who need lawyers are so overburdened. And that's a real problem that we have to address.
And I think, just, I don't know how many of you know, I mean, Norm's talking about the ideals, right? So our Constitution represents a set of ideals, aspirations that should make our society, that we should be living by as guiding principles in our society. But in a couple of recent death penalty cases, the right to counsel and what that has meant has really just kind of been diluted, has been rendered meaningless. Yesterday, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in a case said that a person who was facing the death penalty had a fair trial even though his attorney was severely intoxicated at levels far beyond the legal norm throughout his sentencing phase. They never heard of his tremendous sexual abuse as a child in his house. They never heard all of this evidence that should have mitigated against him receiving the death penalty, and the court said, well, you know what? He had a lawyer. In Texas, several years ago, there was another man facing the death penalty whose lawyer was asleep through much of the trial. There was tons of evidence showing that this man who was there to represent somebody facing the most severe penalty, facing death, execution by the state, had a lawyer sitting by his side who was asleep throughout much of the trial, and his death sentence was upheld. Even though, in effect, what does it mean to have a right to a lawyer? You need a right to an effective lawyer. And as Norm said, in a lot of places, that right is undermined because of lack of resources. Prosecutors have police departments that investigate their cases, and DA's offices often have many more resources than public defender offices. So there's a resource problem, and then sometimes there's a pure kind of a problem of courts actually giving meaning to that right. And that's where responsibility for giving life to the Constitution resides in all of us. As lawyers, that's what we try every day to do in the courts, is to give meaning on behalf of our clients to the Constitution, to make it mean something so that it isn't just this right that exists in a book, but that it means something in people's everyday lives. And that's the challenge of doing criminal justice work is, we have these rights, but how do we actually give them meaning and make them mean something that we think the Constitution says it should?
And I'll tell you how it comes to be that some of those lawyers are appointed. In most jurisdictions in the country, it's the judges themselves who get to decide who is the lawyer who gets to represent this person. And often it's the lowest bidder because the court doesn't want to go over its budget, or it's someone that the judge plays golf with, or whatever. So it's not necessarily the person who knows the law or who knows even what the basic cases are in the criminal justice system. They don't appoint people from the public defender's office, which is often the most expert, even though it has way too many cases. But it's the most expert lawyers. So what you really need is an independent body in each state that says, okay, here's a list of lawyers who qualify, who have tried a number of capital cases, or they've tried a number of criminal cases, and they're known to be highly ethical and highly skilled, and this independent body takes them because of their qualifications and not because of who they played golf with. And then we can avoid the sleeping lawyers, the drunk lawyers, the lawyers who go out and feed their parking meters during critical prosecution testimony. So we have a lot of work to do on our indigent defense system.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, I also wanted to touch upon, remember, I think Norm, my name is Mark, by the way, talked about the underfunding of defense lawyers, and I remember a speaker in my constitutional law class. He was a defense lawyer, and he was talking about some cases, like, for example, like death row cases, they paid defense lawyers like $2,000 per case, which, and you have to think about like the length of how long a death penalty is a case, as well as other like like how much they pay a lawyer per hour is like significantly lower than a prosecution, or also you know, like the amount of cases a lawyer has. Maybe if he has like 5 to 10 cases, he really doesn't like care, or he leeways one case over the rest of the cases.
Right. Well, I think, you know, what you're talking about is a problem that you know, the myth, there are a lot of sub-myths to the myth that everybody gets a good lawyer. And some of the sub-myths are that, you know, there are a lot of lawyers that try very hard, but they're, you know, they have to do triage because they have so many cases. There's another factor which I like to talk about, which is that in general, we don't value criminal defense as much as we value other legal functions in society. The state or a city will pay thousands and thousands of dollars to be represented in a civil case, but they won't pay lawyers more than, in some cases, $40 an hour, $30 an hour, and that's not right. The other thing that I'm sure many of you, you know, from your own life experiences know, is that except for a small segment of lawyers, defense lawyers, who work for big firms and maybe do, you know, are representing corporations, just about all of the lawyers who do criminal defense work are doing, in a sense, quasi-indigent defense work. And what I mean by that is there are people who are too poor to get a lawyer, and so the court appoints them. But then there are a lot of people whose families, you know, they work, they make a decent living, maybe not a lot of money, but then a problem comes along and they don't really have a lot of money. And so there are a lot of lawyers that do a lot of cases who don't get paid very much, but they're still private lawyers. So the whole system really is starved for resources and for funding. And the one thing that bothers me the most as somebody who devoted my life to being a criminal defense lawyer is the notion that the defense lawyer is only there to get someone off. Okay? That's not what the lawyer is there for. Yes, if you're not guilty and there's a way to win the case, that's what my job is. But it's also my job to make sure that the government plays by the rules. Somebody said that the role of the lawyer is to protect individual liberty. Well, by protecting individual liberty, we protect everybody's liberty. You all know that the Fourth Amendment it says you shouldn't have illegal searches and seizures. Well, the only way to protect people's privacy, for the most part, is when they're charged with a crime and you can challenge the legality of the search. So there are values here that we as a society have recognized, but we haven't put it up on a high enough level. You guys have to help us get it up there.
And we're going to get to segue to the next topic because I know we need to move on. Why do you think that public defenders have too many cases now? And remember the first part of this conversation. What were we talking about? Yep, go ahead.
Many people getting arrested.
Too many people getting arrested, right? And when we say too many, look, I think the reality is a lot of people would say if we need to arrest that many people because it keeps us safe, then that's just the way that goes. But the reality is once you really start to understand what percentage of cases are for driving without a license or are crimes of addiction rather than kind of violent crimes, there's a reason why we've seen an explosion in caseloads for public defenders. We're seeing an explosion in arrest rates, an explosion in the kinds of crimes that lawmakers have now deemed need to be addressed by the criminal justice behavior that the lawmakers now deem to need to be addressed by the criminal justice system. And so you can see how one problem feeds into another in the criminal justice system. And I think it's important to just keep our mind on that as we understand the processes in the criminal justice system. But we can move on to the fourth myth.
Yeah, sure. So the fourth myth is that the accused always get a defense on TV. It's the dramatic, the trial is the most dramatic part. This is where sort of the rubber hits the road, where the defendant takes the stand and the prosecutor is able to get him to admit that he committed the crime, or that the eyewitness is, under cross-examination by the defense team, falls apart, and it's all very dramatic and it makes for great TV. But is this how most criminal trials are resolved? Ginny?
I want to, excuse me, ask a question of all of you first, and that is, is there anyone in this room who has not watched one of the Law and Order shows, or NCIS, or one of the other crime shows? Really?
You must not watch TV, because there's a show on every night.
Yeah, wow. That's
You haven't
amazing.
seen it? Okay.
But it's obviously all but one. And it is true that in all of these cases, or in most of these shows, the person is seen going to trial and it gets resolved very quickly, and that's not the way it is in real life. In real life, around 96% of cases in the federal system and in the state system are resolved through plea bargains. There is no trial at all. And the Supreme Court has recently recognized that you have to have a lawyer in the plea bargaining process, but that is sometimes honored in the breach. For example, there's an organization whose board I'm on, it's based in Georgia, and they have found situations in courtrooms deep in Georgia where they bring in a whole bunch of defendants in orange jumpsuits, and they're all handcuffed together. And the prosecutor and the judge say to them, we're going to work out deals for each of you, and you can take it, and you'll probably be able to walk out of here today. Or if you want to exercise your right to go to trial, then fine, that you have that constitutional right, but you're going to go back to your jail cell, and you'll sit there for 2 weeks or 2 months or however long it takes us to find you a lawyer. And what do you think those defendants are going to do? They're going to take the plea. And then they've never even seen a defense lawyer who might say, whoa, wait a minute, you've got a defense here, or we can get you a better deal than they're offering you, or let's just think this through. They've never even seen a defense lawyer. The other thing that the defense lawyer might say is, if you plead guilty, there are consequences beyond whether you go to jail or not. You might, if it's a drug offense, not be able to live in public housing anymore, and that's where your parents live. So you're not going to be able to live with your parents. There might be consequences to what kinds of jobs you can get. In one case that the Supreme Court considered, the lawyer never told the defendant, and this was a defendant who actually had a lawyer, but the lawyer was so ignorant that he told the defendant that because he was an undocumented person here, don't worry, you won't get deported. Well, as soon as he pleaded guilty, he was deported. That's what's called a collateral consequence. There are lots of collateral consequences to pleading guilty, and unless you have a lawyer who's going to tell you that, it's not likely the prosecutor is going to tell you that, then there are all sorts of bad things that can happen to you besides pleading, besides perhaps going to jail, and going to jail or prison for a longer time than you would have had you waited and talked to a lawyer. But the judges don't want these big caseloads. They want things to move along. The prosecutors want things to move along, and they want conviction rates. That's good for their records. And the defendants are sort of in the middle of this. And so it's the depictions of people going to trial are false. That's generally not what happens, and B, the plea bargaining system is pretty much of a mess. It's very haphazard across the country, and often you see people pleading guilty without the benefit of legal advice, which is a really bad thing to do. I know we're running short on time, and we have people who are probably tweeting in questions. So
well, there was one question, and this is to you, Ginny, from Woday, who just wants to know what organization in Georgia you were referring to.
It's called the Southern Center for Human Rights. It's a great organization that does death penalty defense and indigent defense, and it litigates and it advocates and does prison condition cases, and it's schr.org.
Can I ask a question? What do you think would happen if everyone who got arrested and who had charges against them basically asserted their right to trial? They said, I'm not going to take a plea. What do you think would happen? Go ahead.
There wouldn't be as many people in jail or like have long sentences if they actually got trial and actually came up with like logical sentences. It wouldn't be like, citizens wouldn't be like, disproportionate. It wouldn't be like people get more time for simple crimes that.
Why do you think that going to trial would result in fewer people going to prison?
Because when I look at trial, I look at people coming up for the best solution for that person. Like stealing, if you actually go to trial, actually look at all the evidence and think out in your head, think out what is a good solution for this. Sending somebody to 50 years in jail is not going to stop the stealing, right? And it's not going to teach that person a lesson.
But think about what a trial is. Think about what they show on these TV shows. They show witnesses being examined and then cross-examined, and judges making rulings and lawyers making arguments. Does that take longer than a plea bargain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just say from our online universe, SM Kyle 1 suggests that if everyone went to trial, the system would crash.
That is exactly right.
Yeah, you laugh, but actually the system probably would crash because there aren't resources in the system for everyone to assert their right to trial. And there's a woman by the name of Susan Burton out in California. She's a woman who had cycled in and out of prison for about 25 years and who now is an advocate for reform and for indigent defense reform and criminal justice reform. And she says that she wants to test that theory, that if you picked one jurisdiction and you had every single person, it's a tough theory, but I think it's worth kind of thinking through what this would mean, that asserting the right to trial would make the system crash because of kind of how many people are arrested, and that the system really depends on a certain number of people pleading out. Unfortunately, going to trial doesn't yield the kind of justice or better solutions or problem solving that you might hope a trial would. Oftentimes the reality too is that taking a plea is the better thing to do in terms of what this person could face in terms of a sentence if they went to trial. And that's the reality, and that's why people take plea deals, is because there's a significantly lower sentence that they may be able to get if they take a plea deal rather than go to trial and risk being convicted of either something that they didn't do or anything else. But it's something to think about is, the system might crash.
Let me give you an example of how the system can crash and how the system will try to protect itself from that happening. This is a real live case that happened a couple of years ago in a small county in Ohio. Individual was charged with an assault. He was appointed a public defender. The judge wanted the individual to plead guilty. Prosecutor made an offer. Individual wasn't interested in pleading guilty, and the judge told the lawyer, who had just met his client, okay, this was in the morning. He said, I want you back here at 2 o'clock. We're going to try this case. What? Lawyer said, I can't try this case. I haven't investigated it. I haven't really talked to my client. I haven't interviewed witnesses. The judge said, no. We're going to move this case. Either your client's going to plead or you're going to trial this afternoon. Well, the lawyer refused. He was held in contempt. It went all the way up to the appellate courts in Ohio, and the lawyer was upheld and the case was sent back. But that just shows you how the system wants these cases to move. And we've got to do something about that. We've got to empower lawyers to say no. We've got to deal with the problem. We found in one study in Florida, we came out with a report called 3-Minute Justice, studied over 20 counties in Florida and found that the average amount of time that a case was pending was 3 minutes. That's not justice.
And let me add one more thing about plea bargaining, and you can have no lawyers at all, or you can have bad lawyers for the reasons that I discussed earlier. But there's one example that I thought was quite striking, where the prosecution offered a deal of if the defendant pled guilty of 90 days, and if the defendant went to trial, then it would be a period of years in prison. And the lawyer never communicated the deal to the defendant. And so the defendant went to trial and was convicted and was sentenced to several years in prison, and found out only later that there had been this deal offered to his lawyer, who hadn't told him about it. And he said, I would have taken that deal in a minute. So there are all sorts of rights that come together here: the right to trial, the need to plea bargain, or the fact that a plea bargain might be better off, the defendant might be better off taking a plea bargain. There's also the question of innocent people pleading guilty. Often you find that people who suffer from mental retardation or whatever, they're terrified, and they think that I'll just get this over with and plead guilty, and they're not really guilty at all. And there have been a lot of studies that show that at least 6% of the guilty pleas are from people who are innocent. And so it's all of these rights, all the Sixth Amendment right to counsel, cruel and unusual punishment, the right to a jury trial, all of these things are in the Bill of Rights. You should read your constitutions and figure out how all of these things come together, but how they don't come together in a way that works very well. And our criminal justice system is just it's a mess. It's a mess. The three of us up here spend most of our waking hours, and include Christopher in this, the four of us, trying to improve the criminal justice system. And for those of you who want to be lawyers, or even if you don't want to be lawyers, there are lots of ways that you can help. And I think we all encourage you to do that, to join forces with us and try to change things.
All right, we're going to move on to our last topic. I just want to mention, seeing how all these things connect, the case that Ginny mentioned where the lawyer didn't communicate the plea deal. He was being charged with driving without a license, and I think that going to trial, he ended up getting 3+ years for that. So now...
And the deal would have been 90 days.
And the deal would have been 90 days
yeah.
In jail for driving without a license. Now we're going to move on to our last topic, which, judging from the tweets we're receiving, is probably going to be the topic that really gets people most engaged and turned on, is justice is blind.
So, I mean, we've talked a little bit, each of us, I think, about the race disparities in the system. How many of you think justice is blind in this country? Is blind, meaning we know that we want it to be blind, but actually is blind. Raise your hands.
No, not at all.
Raise your hands. Raise your hands if you think justice is blind. Blind means that it is objective, that no other factors get in the way of having a just criminal justice system. Okay, I think my question's confusing you, because you guys are saying, yeah, no way, but you're not raising your hand. So the reality, what would it mean to have a justice system that's blind? Yeah.
It would mean that no matter the race, the penalty or the consequence for a crime would be the same for all races or like genders or whatever.
So the woman in the back said that no matter what the race is of the person who may be the accused, that the penalty would be the same. What else? What else would it mean to have a justice system that is objective, that doesn't take into account or doesn't have any kind of racial bias? Yep.
I think it would take a lot. That I don't think it would change the justice system completely, simply because everyone, in a way, is biased. No matter how people think, your bias, because as people you have your own set of mind, and the only way that you could change that is the influence of somebody else. So in a way that you could change that is if you have to make it, you have to really get in contact of what the issue is. If you see a lot of young people getting arrested, then you should address, then that's a problem. Or like, it's not, you have to look at both sides. Okay, well, it's a lot of drugs going on, but is it just that who's buying them, who's the demand, who's out to get them, or like it's even government corruption. It's people in government that's involved with this, and we see it every day. Kwame Brown just went to jail of what he did, and people say what he did was he didn't do it, or just because he pleaded. I mean, if you plead, then why you ain't go to trial? I mean, if you
there's a lot of and I think you're pointing to a lot of different parts of the system, or a lot of there's all of us have attitudes and stereotypes because we grow up, we watch TV, we watch those stereotypes get perpetuated on TV and that kind of thing, and I think that definitely influences. That influences all of us in the decisions we make. And in the criminal justice system, at every point in the system where there is some discretion, where a criminal justice actor is choosing or is making a decision, for example, about who to arrest, where to be policing, whether to bring charges and whether to bring higher charges or lower charges. At every stage of the criminal justice system, we see that racial bias has infected the system. And so we end up with a system where, despite the fact that there are, government surveys suggest that people use drugs at a rate proportional to their representation in the general public. So African Americans are, 13% of the American public. That black men and women actually are arrested, or make up 35% of all drug arrests, 44% of all drug convictions, and 51% of state drug prisoners. And so you see the influence of racial bias throughout as the system goes in. So I don't know if there's questions. Since we don't have that much time, I'd like to see if there's questions.
Mr. Brown 34 asks, what does it mean that there were more stop and frisks of black men in New York City last year than there are actually black men in New York City?
So who wants to answer that? Go ahead.
Well, it's not only in New York, but I can see it's in DC too. Yep. We see in Metro how the police forces are like using the issue of safety and bringing the dogs in, and I guess using the dogs to find if there's drugs or there's weapons on these metro system, and also just be, like you said, being where to be at night. Like, you're not gonna go, especially in DC, you're not gonna go at Georgetown at night. This is like a safe area, but if you go like somewhere else, Southeast, then they think there's a high possible chance of finding drugs, and they do just kind of like stop and search you in a way, and the system allows that now through different laws and stuff.
And in New York, those statistics point to the fact that people in certain neighborhoods are getting stop and frisked multiple times a year. Go ahead, in the back.
Okay. This is referring to something else, but it's dealing with somewhat dealing with that topic. If you notice, if you're in DC, if you're in Southeast, or if you're on the Southeast side, you see a lot of liquor stores and gas stations and all that. But when you go up Georgetown, you don't see no liquor store. You'll probably see a wine store, not like a liquor store where you get a 40-ounce store or something, whatever over there. But it's like, okay, it's more police over here on the Southeast side because the things that's over there. But why are they being put over there? And there's nothing up Georgetown, stuff like that. You don't see a liquor store or like a 24-hour store of Georgetown. You might see a 7-Eleven. You don't see no 7-Eleven on the Southeast side.
But I think an important thing to know, like in New York City, there's been a lot of attention to the stop and frisk problem, which I agree is actually a national problem, although we're talking about it mostly in New York. It would be some people would be able to justify it if that level of stopping and frisking folks in certain neighborhoods, black and brown folks in certain neighborhoods, resulted in detection of criminal activity. But the reality is that of the over 500,000 people that are stop and frisked in certain neighborhoods in New York, black and brown folks, only, I think it's somewhere between 5 and 6% have yielded or led to any kind of arrest. And that means that there are a huge number of New Yorkers that are being stopped and frisked on the basis of the color of their skin and where they live, who have never committed any kind of criminal activity, and it makes people in these communities feel like they are under siege by the police, and it's a real problem.
And let me just make the point, which I think you probably all get, which is that if you did the same kind of policing in Georgetown or the Upper East Side, and you stopped people and you frisked them and you looked to see what they had in their pockets, you would have the same or perhaps even a higher level of arrests. That's just the reality of it. We've made, again, as a society, we've made policing choices which have created a system that is fundamentally unfair and discriminatory.
I would add to that if you had the same kind of policing, the stop and frisk policies that you have in Southeast or Northeast, if you had that in Georgetown and they were stopping and frisking white people all the time, we wouldn't have those kind of stop and frisk policies.
Let me pick on someone who hasn't spoken. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Chris. You do it. Go.
Okay. Speaking about the stopping and frisking, like discrimination towards Black and Latinos, it's like the way you look or what you wear. Like, for example, Trayvon Martin, he had a black hoodie and he was like chased down by someone because he had a black hoodie and because he was black. So, like, especially with the stopping and frisking, what you look like and what, like in DC, if you have dreads, for example, this is a stereotype that, oh, you're doing something bad, or you're like, I guess you're bad or something like that, or you're up to no good. And yeah, that's one thing that we face as a problem in our country. It's just the discrimination towards young Black and Latino individuals.
So, what part of the Constitution allows us to try to do something about kind of unequal enforcement or unequal policing or unequal prosecutions? The 5th, and there's one other amendment in the Constitution.
Right here.
The 14th, yeah. So the 5th and 14th Amendments guarantee equal protection under the law. Now, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, yeah, it sucks that the police are not blind like they should be. But if we look like in New York, I actually read an article about the stop and frisk one in New York and Harlem. If we see they've been doing that for a while now, and the crimes in Harlem has actually decreased. So I feel like we should look at it in the positive way, that crime has gone down because of these searches. So I just wanted to put that out there, because we're all talking about the negatives, but we should also look at the positives.
So there have been some articles, and that's the line that the New York Police Department uses to justify its program, but actually there's a lot of very different, incredible research that shows that the crime rates are down all over the country, right? And in a lot of parts of the country, they have not adopted the NYPD's stop and frisk tactics. And also that in the last 10 years, that stop and frisk has really gotten heightened. Certain crimes have actually gone up in New York City, like robbery and gun, I think it was gun possession charges. And so we have to be very careful about how we understand that narrative, because the reality is crime rates are down all over the country for a host of different reasons that have nothing to do with the NYPD stop and frisk rate. And that to me is a really severe limitation in the New York Police Department's justification for why they are stopping and frisking so many people in Brownsville.
I was watching a documentary on this, and it said that a lot of people, it interviewed people who have been stopped by the police in New York, and a lot of people said say if they had marijuana in their pocket, or they had a weapon or something, but it wasn't visible. They said that the police would take it out and be like, oh, you point it out, and then stuff like that would lead to arrest. They were kind of I guess the police would kind of set them up so where they would get arrested.
Yeah, there was a problem with entrapment for marijuana possession, where the police were asking people on the streets. And in New York City, actually, marijuana is decriminalized. They deal with marijuana possession not through the criminal justice system, but through alternate sanctions. And and the NYPD, after there had been a lot of controversy around this, actually, changed its internal policy around and supposedly told its officers that they cannot ask people to turn out their pockets, but that was definitely happening, and a lot of people were calling that a form of entrapment, that you're entrapping someone into committing a crime where they shouldn't actually, they were not being permitted. They shouldn't have had the right to do that search. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also feel like the cops use fear as a way to scare people into doing whatever they feel like they need. For example, I guess if they stop you just to frisk you, to search you, they ask you like multiple questions, and sometimes you can't like think, you're scared or whatever, and you're nervous, and not all the answers come to mind, and they suspect you of being under influence or having drug possessions or having a weapon. So I guess that fear, the method of fear, is also an issue too, and the overpower of police forces.
And we've been talking a lot about kind of the ways in which you all have experienced or know unequal enforcement by police. But as I said, there are other actors in the criminal justice system that make decisions every day about who to prosecute, what to prosecute, what to charge. And in those decisions, when we see statistically, we see significant race disparities, despite evidence that shows that across the board, it isn't that black folks are using more drugs at a higher rate than whites and we know that college campuses aren't policed in the same way that certain neighborhoods are. And so there are, it's important to understand. And oftentimes the law, while we have the 5th and 14th Amendments, and lawyers will try to challenge unequal enforcement, it's become very difficult to make the case in a court of law to show unequal enforcement. The courts have said, well, until you can prove that somebody made a very explicit decision to target a black person or to target a black community or brown community, it has to be a very conscious decision or intentional discrimination. You can't make out a claim of discrimination. And yet, what you were saying is we carry stereotypes, we carry perceptions. Sometimes it's very unconscious. All of the kind of the images and messages and stereotypes that we have, and there has been no way to really attack or challenge unconscious racism and racial bias as it plays itself out in the system. And that's, again, part of the work that we all have to do, is that we give life to the Constitution, and it's up to us to advocate and to show when we find unequal enforcement and disparate treatment, to give that meaning to the Constitution.
Those are great closing words for this event. I want to thank our panelists for doing a great job. Again, I want to thank Brave New Films for the movie that they produced for us. I want to thank our online viewers, especially those who tweeted comments and questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, but we really appreciate your engagement. And most of all, I want to thank Cesar Chavez. This class was phenomenal. You guys are awesome.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it.
This is going to be webcast, right?
Yes. In addition to this live webcast, this will be archived so that people can go and watch it at any time that's convenient for them. And for those of you who RSVP'd, we'll be sending out the link to the archived version of this. So thank you again.
Thank you.